Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and today I'm really excited to have a special guest on the podcast. Dorsey Nunn is a author. He's a criminal justice reform expert and formerly incarcerated, and now a director of two organizations that improve conditions for those imprisoned and in order to rebuild their lives after release. Dorsey, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. You've got two organizations that you're part of: Legal Services for Prisoners with Children (LSPC) and All of Us or None. I love that name, and they're really impressive restorative justice efforts that are highlighting the injustices and advocating and practicing reforms that really do make a huge difference. And from what I've read, your impacts include ending long term solitary confinement, improving prison conditions, expanding access to housing and employment, and restoring voting rights to people on parole and probation. So, this is why I wanted to have you on the podcast. Restorative justice is right up my alley. I've been writing about it from a theological perspective, but I wanted to get someone like you on to really talk about the practical applications of it and what a difference it makes and why we really need it and what some of the injustices are. Um, so it's also part of an approach to kind of combat the often retributive and punitive approach that so many people have on crime. And we're going to talk about, things like why in the world does the U.S. have one of the highest, if not the highest, incarceration rate, at least in the global north, and things like that, and why is it that particularly conservative Christians with their theology seem to have more of a tough on crime, pro capital punishment, etc., and not really understand the importance of restorative justice and how it uh, really dovetails with what Jesus taught as far as restoration of relationships and equality. So your work is a great example of this, and also you have a book. What kind of bird is this? A memoir of resilience and resurrection. I love
By the
that
way,
title.
the book is What Kind of Bird Can't Fly?
Oh, I'm sorry. I got the title wrong. What kind of bird can't
Can't
fly?
Fly.
Right, that's it. And so I thought maybe you could start by uh, giving us a short summary, giving us a summary of what that book is about. What is your story behind that book, and what got you um, the experience that you have address these issues?
One of the things that happened along the way, because I have a long history, and prison was a part of it. But a lot of the stuff that I did as a result of going to prison, uh, like if you wind up with prison at the age of 19, serving a life sentence, uh, you do a lot of thinking.
Yeah.
You know, how did I find myself in that situation? You know, and while I was sitting in prison, one of the things I was thinking about was, I thought about like, uh, where were my initial contacts with law enforcement? And my initial contacts with law enforcement had very little to do with crime and more to do with race.
Yeah. Right.
And when I moved to Menlo Park, which is sits about 5 miles from Stanford, one of the probably one of the major universities in the United States, and the place that they probably did the first heart transplant in the country. Uh, and when we first initially moved in, when my parents walked me to school in kindergarten, they didn't necessarily walk me to school because they thought I was going to get lost, and they didn't walk me to school that long because they thought I was going to get lost. They knew I knew my way to school. But when we initially moved into a predominantly white area, the first thing that happened was that people immediately start fleeing the community. It was white flight,
Right.
it was blockbusting, it was redlining. There was a whole bunch of other things that was going there before I had the language to define that stuff. And some parts of that right there also was being reinforced in part by the police, So like initially, when everybody fled, probably the thing that stood out for me was that when I got to prison, I understood how come I was reading at a remedial level once I started reading. And that was with white flight, it also somewhat damaged the educational system that was in place.
Right.
But nobody ever accounted for it. The education became unequal. Nobody accounted for that. Even as a kid, I could see that my parents was frightened, and the reason that they were walking me to school was to make sure that I got there safely, not because I couldn't look both ways to cross the street. They thought I couldn't care and defend myself.
Right.
So, like, and the first time that I was stopped and I had the real encounter with the police, that they was taking my bicycle.
Oh, right. I remember that story in your book. Okay.
And, so like when they took that bicycle, they didn't account for the fact that when they had this massive number of people leaving the community, they were leaving all kind of stuff. It wasn't like, they were abandoning stuff. It was like they free the black people coming in. but nobody could account for that right there. And when they couldn't find a serial number on the bicycle, they took the bicycle. That was my initial contact. So you imagine yourself as a kid, and the thing that you wanted the most of for your Christmas present was a bicycle. At least that's what it was for me.
Right.
And that was, a real big experience of having the bicycle that I finally got for Christmas. And it was my first bicycle. And before I got on Christmas break, before I actually could ride to school the first day, it had already been confiscated by the police.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess they pulled over and questioned you.
Pulled over and questioned me on the corner of Hollyburn in Hamilton. And by the way, I'm 72 years old at this point, so I could remember both the bicycle and the police stopping me.
Right. Right.
And where they stopped me. In fact, I still stay in my neighborhood right now. And so like when I'm walking my dog, I'm walking past like what sits there on the corner of Hollyburn and Hamilton. That's where I go drop my mail in the mailbox right now.
Right. Yeah, you would think they'd have something better to do than pull over a kid with a bicycle.
And the next time that I got stopped, because like when you ask me where I stay in Menlo Park, and what divides Menlo Park, and it still exists somewhat today, is the first highway that they built in Northern California. And that's the Bay Shore Freeway, and that's Highway 101. And on west of me is essentially still a predominantly white area. The area that I stay in is not a predominantly white area.
Right.
And it's becoming more whiter all the time,
Yeah.
Because like what also sits in my neighborhood right now is Facebook. So, and when I took over custody of my mother's house, at the point that I did it in 1990, this house was valued at about $84,000. And it's probably valued over $1 million right now, and along with that, a lot of my neighbors moved. But the next time that I got stopped by the police was we kept moving around the neighborhood, because my father was thinking about, having a great school to put his kids in. And at certain points, he couldn't necessarily possibly always pay the rent or pay the mortgage, and we kept moving. And the next time that I moved is probably the last predominantly white area in East Palo Alto, and it was the Village. And when I went over to retrieve a ball from the neighbor, when me and my brother was playing catch, and jumped the fence to get the ball, that ultimately the police was called, and they took me down to the station for trespassing. They also at a certain point jammed me up for being incorrigible, which caused a rift. Because I was thinking that my parents had called the police on me, and it was the school system that did that, and so that was probably my introduction,
Right.
to
Okay.
who the police was,
Right.
And that was the introduction in part. When people were telling me I could be anything that I wanted to be, there was another group of actors in the mix that was practically defining who I was.
Right. Right. So it was, like you said, it was more about race than it was about crime. Also, it sounds like the educational system in the areas where you lived were downgraded the more white flight happened, and so you didn't have the quality of schools that your father was looking for.
I think the white flight preceded the downgrade.
Yes,
So
right.
it was mainly a middle class neighborhood that we was moving into, and I know how blockbusting work at this point, and
Right.
redlining and all the rest of it. But the thing that stands out, the first chapter of that book is innocence unavailable and guilt not required. That's the first chapter I wrote.
Right.
Because at the point of me writing that chapter, what I'm trying to point out, it's at no point as a Black person, probably from the age of 6 or 7, that I was entitled to the presumption of innocence.
Right. You were always presumed guilty.
I was always presumed guilty.
Right.
In fact, Black people probably sitting in some jail right now that can't make bail is not. That's a practical experience. They're presumed to be guilty and they're presumed to be dangerous, so we're not letting them out.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing of it is that when the plea bargains come, because like most of the time that people are actually in this criminal justice system, what's inducing the plea bargain is what induces the plea bargain is people being maintained in custody for long periods of time until they can extract the plea bargain. And the other thing that they actually doing is Black people or brown people and other people in jail know that when they come with the offer, it's like, hey, I'm gonna give you 20 years if you go to trial, or I'm gonna give you 3.
Yeah, right. So that's kind of the way they manipulate people into taking a plea deal, right?
Yeah, and it's really surprising, like, because like sometimes, from my perspective, things that I think about, and it could be abstract ways of thinking about it that's correlates probably the question of race, is that you have the president, the presidential candidates running right now, and one of them is running with 34 felonies.
Yeah.
While people still can't vote in jails and prisons.
Yeah, convicted. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
We can't vote in jails and prison. The guy's convicted running for president.
Know, it's crazy. It's crazy.
So maybe y'all not having a relationship
really
with something like truth or anything else.
So then at that point, you ended up getting in trouble because of these issues over and over again. You had a line in there that it said, if this was how the cops were going to see me, this was what I would become. And I can see how that would happen, but that you were just kind of like going down this path. But you know, according to the authorities, you're always guilty. You're always a criminal. And so eventually you got uh, put
So
into
like, no
juvenile
matter who was
detention
telling,
and also getting that life sentence. Tell us about what
and,
that progression was like.
and by the way, no matter who was telling me what I could be, you had
Yeah.
a different group of people who were defining me to the point of me actually becoming that.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can say it, because like they could say, like, here are some of the people they told me I could be. Probably in the second or third grade. You can be Harry Belafonte. No, I couldn't.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I wasn't talented that way. You could be Willie Mays. No, I couldn't. I was short.
Yeah. Right.
The police was telling me something else. You a thug, you a criminal, and all the rest of that stuff. So that's who I believe, because they was actually exercising something that actually resulted in more than inconvenience. It was actually defining who that I ultimately thought I was. And when I went to prison, the thing that I stepped into was an environment that there was more people that was in prison when I stepped through the door than all the other black men and people in my neighborhood. I went to dual vocational institution, and when I got there was a color scheme. There was a significant number of black people in the year in which I got there was 1972.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what preceded me is that I got there probably less than a year from the Marin County shootout that killed Jonathan Jackson, and Rochelle McGee was killed. I got there less than a year from the death of George Jackson, which was a revolutionary that was inside of San Quentin State Prison. I got there less than a year from the Attica Rebellion that followed George
right.
Jackson.
I remember that. Yeah.
I got there less than 4 years, less than 4 years before the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. I got there and people were dying and getting stabbed all the time. So I got there at the age of I was arrested at the age of 19, at the age of 20. That's what went there. So and when I got there, I suffered from an inadequate education. I barely could read, and the kind of materials that I was reading. I had a friend, like the person who got stopped with me for picking up a sprinkler at a school, and it wasn't like we thought it was scrap metal and we was hitting rocks with it. It wasn't like we were stealing or consciously stealing, and that was Nate. And when I got there, he was there, and we hadn't seen each other because he had moved to San Francisco, probably since we was childhood friends. And I was walking out, and I was reading, I think, struggling and trying to read Louis L'Amour book. And I was reading a cowboy book. And when he called me, and one day he called me, and I had a book in my hand, I was trying to read and struggle through it. And he asked me, what was I studying to become a cowboy?
Okay.
And subsequently, he seen I was struggling with reading. And he would take me out, and he started teaching me how to read.
That's good.
And for me, it's more than good, because it changed the course of my life.
Yeah, I bet it did. So what led you to getting arrested and getting such a crazy sentence, a life sentence at age 19?
At the age of life, I went in and I was participated in the robbery that a person died in the liquor store being robbed.
Okay.
So I think it was a felony murder rule. And I had never at that point, I had never thought about killing anybody, And in fact, I probably didn't think about that kind of stuff until after I got to prison.
Right.
That wasn't like.
So you were involved in a robbery. Someone in your group killed someone at the store. But
And,
you were
and that's what
charged. Was the
I
whole
was
group
charged. I
charged?
was charged with probably under the felony murder rule or the murder felony rule, that everybody is equally guilty in the participation of a crime that leads to the death of a person.
Right.
You know, not only that, probably, and I didn't show up like a normal person would, because I was in the streets. And, so like when I went to court, I had very little clothes that looked like I was a student or I was a worker. I showed up in court wearing a purple crushed velvet suit with a satin shirt.
Okay.
It was like
Flamboyant.
And all my friends was burnt orange, lime green, and it in fact I had to ask them to stop coming to court. I couldn't see myself, but I could see them. I said, man, y'all looking crazy. But
You're not helping me. Yeah.
I hadn't did any real internal processes. And that became, probably as a result of reading and as a result of what I was reading. Because if I moved away from Louis L'Amour books, cowboy books, and girly magazines, I started reading different material.
Right.
In fact, I can remember being in a whole segregation unit. And I can remember a person didn't call himself a minister, but he told me of religious stories. And it wasn't until probably maybe 30 or 40 days I figured out that it was the same stories that my mother used to tell me when I was a kid.
Okay. All right.
Right? So like Jesus in the hole that I was in, he wasn't Jesus. He was Jerusalem Slim.
Mm-hmm.
And he stopped somebody from beating a woman down and stoning her to death because she was an adulteress.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
I see. Okay.
So he took the story and,
right.
Because we didn't have TVs in the hole and we hanging on every word. He was reciting parts of the Bible. Just he dressed it up using a different language.
Right. So you could relate to it. Right.
I could relate to it,
Right. That's
in a
cool.
real particular way, and he was highlighting different things, so when they came to get Jerusalem Slim, one of his homies chopped off an ear.
Oh, right. One of his homies. Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. So that makes sense.
Yeah,
that's called contextualizing the gospel so people understand it in their terms.
Yeah, I couldn't really hear my mother, but I could hear him.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. It's easier. Right.
Gas. He had a real good story.
So after being, sentenced to life, I mean, how did you get redeemed from that? What did you have or Innocence Project type of
I didn't have
organization helping you?
People at the time, before people went mad with punishment.
Yeah.
Because in 1972, you would be eligible for parole, even serving a life sentence after 7 years.
Okay.
Right now, if you get a life sentence, it's 25 to life. And society has shifted in such a way. And when they were shifting, after I learned how to read, because people were getting the newspaper, and like some of my friends was like, the first thing they would take out the newspaper was the sport pages. And they'd give me the rest of the newspaper. So I'm reading the editorials, I'm reading the headlines, and I can see the politics shifting.
Right.
And as it was shifting,
you're talking about
thinking,
the shift being more tough on crime, right?
Yeah, it's tough on crime. And I got to say, how do I make it to the gate and get out before they actually standardize a life sentence being 25 to life? And you would be eligible at the 16 years and 8 months. I got out in approximately 11, but some parts of that is because I learned how to read. And at the
Okay.
same time, when I learned how to read, there was something else that happened, was that my world became larger and smaller at the same time. So it's
Right.
like, in terms of what I read a little bit of everything after I learned how to read. I read George Jackson's book, Blood in My Eye, and I read it in longhand because it was contraband. And people wrote books out that they didn't think that we when they started making books contraband, we were copying it, and we was beginning to read it in longhand. So I read Blood in My Eye, a chapter at the time, and it wasn't lined up from chapter 1 to chapter whatever. And I read chapter 1. Anybody got chapter 2? And we was trading books that was there. So I read George Jackson. I read George Orwell.
Okay. All right.
I read Cornforth, Dialectical Materialism. I read Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. I read The Wretch of the Earth. I read Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. I read a whole bunch of different books. And that's what I'm saying. As I was in prison, my world was expanding.
Yeah, right.
In a real prolific way. And my intellect was also expanding.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was happening as a result of the era that I came from, people were holding political educations on the yard. And one of the people who were teaching me how to read and who was grooming me, because not everybody thought they was going to get out, they thought that I was going to get out.
I see. They had hope for you, right?
They had hope for me. Elders had hope for me that was in prison.
Right. But these were prisoners, fellow prisoners who were teaching you how to read, etc.
How to read. And
right.
Not only did they teach me how to read, what I promised was that I promised that I return to the community an asset instead of a liability.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good.
And to this day, I have not had any other job other than fighting for the full restoration of civil and human rights for people who have been incarcerated,
right,
and formerly incarcerated people.
Yeah, we want to get into some more details about that later, but another question I had was, give us some examples of, like, what did you observe in, as far as examples of racism in policing and in the courts and in your prison experience?
My prison experience is walking through the door. It was, prison had a color scheme. All the black people that was locked up there, you immediately know that.
Mm-hmm.
And in the event that you didn't know it, when they had a whole bunch of violence happening in prison, as soon as they had somebody escort me from receiving and release that was a prisoner, the prisoners defined that stuff. When the first person I seen get stabbed inside of the chow hall, or the dining room, as they would call it, the person that, and it was shocking, stunning to me, because like I had never seen anybody stabbed in the back.
Oh, I see.
And I said, did
San
you
Quentin?
see that? And the person that, no, here's education. Did you see that? I ain't seen nothing. And motherfucker, you didn't either.
Right. Okay.
That, you get, as they were saying, they'll lace your boots up real fast. So you'll know what is culturally appropriate in the situation that was there. And being that there was always violence happening along racial lines, you knew where you stood out and who you stood with. So like even walking down the hallway, going from the reception center to where I ultimately stayed, when I looked in the unit, I seen a whole bunch of black people standing on the tier. And I seen black people all over, and that was different because, like, even in San Mateo County right now, we have had only one countywide black elected official. This is in California. This is not in Alabama.
Right. Right.
So like to the most part, I think that racism is so prevalent in many regards. It's just taken for normal.
Yeah. Right. Was this in San Quentin where you were?
I was in DVI at first. They held me there from 20 to 23.
Okay.
Then when I got transferred to San Quentin, probably right before my 24th birthday, and I'd have been totally DVI was called Gladiator School.
Gladiator. Now, why was it called Gladiator School? You learned how to fight?
Learned how to fight. I learned when I went in, I was weighing about 145 pounds. I was doing all kind of exercises because what I was, and like I said, at a certain point, I started really assessing who I became as I matured. I started lifting weights and all the rest of it. So, like, in the book, a chapter in the book, I wrote "Commitment to Kill." What I should have wrote that chapter to say is "Commitment to Kill in Order to Live."
Okay.
Because I started buffing up. I started getting larger. I started getting stronger. I started preparing myself to actually do violence. And I started asking myself a question that I had never asked. Would I kill? I had never asked that on the streets.
Right.
And it was that fear-driven that was there. I had never ran across groups of white people that was so extreme. Since I was being walked to school, I didn't really have to find that. So what happens when you start running across white Nazis, Aryan Brotherhood members when you was in jail? What
Oh, they
happens
were Aryan Brotherhood and white
all the
Nazis.
rest of that stuff that was there in the environment?
Okay.
So like the racism I ran into on the streets when I was coming up it had an impact, but it didn't represent the greatest degree. It's like, it's being called out your name. I had never heard terms like jungle bunny, coon.
Yeah.
It was like racism took a art form.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
It was the language.
Right. The language of racism. Right.
The language of racism was
The labels
much more
that tell
pronounced.
you. Right. Exactly.
Much more pronounced.
Right.
The symbols of people's being tattooed. You can read it.
Yeah.
You can read teardrops on the face that indicates that people had stabbed people before. It was certain things that you can just read physically. And when you stepped out, even with blacks, they was lifting a whole bunch of weights, but these other white guys were lifting weights too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Other Mexicans was lifting weight. How do you define the Latinos, from Norteños and Serranos, all the rest of that stuff? It was being at DVI when you said the racism. It was really, really learning the scheme of how to survive when I was in prison.
Right.
And some parts of that was had racial overtones, all the rest of that stuff.
So, one of the things that you brought out in the book is that you said that actually slavery still exists in the prison systems in the U.S. How does that work? The work.
And you know what?
The work.
Not only does it work,
involuntary servitude.
Right, like involuntary servitude is in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
And in terms of California, it's Article 1, Section 6. And for the last 4 years, I've been fighting the end involuntary servitude in the California prison system. And it took us 2 efforts. And this year, in November, when everybody's going to be talking about who do we elect as the president, one of the reasons that I'm going to the poll and cast the vote is to change the Constitution of the state of California to prohibit the practice of slavery and prohibit the practice of involuntary
So explain
servitude.
how that works.
So the way that it works is that you go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
You get a job assignment. And the most that I ever made working in prison was 30 cents an hour or 32 cents an hour.
Wow.
In the event that I worked and I didn't work, if I didn't actually perform certain works, like working in a child hall, sweeping the tier, ultimately at the end of the sentence doing working in a detergent factory, which, you know, had chemicals that could burn me and all the rest of that stuff if mixed appropriately, or inappropriately, because I didn't know how to mix initially. That stuff right there, that was labor that was being extracted through coercion, force, or and the coercion is, if you don't work, you won't necessarily be seen as being eligible for parole. If you don't work, you wouldn't get.
I see. Yeah.
Reductions in your custody level. If you didn't work, you could get put in the hole, and you couldn't get contact visits. If you didn't work,
The hold meaning solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement, relationship and separated from the other parts of the population. And in fact, the guy who taught me how to read, which was my childhood friend Nate, he refused to work the whole time that he was there. You know, but he didn't. He had a sentence at the top. I couldn't afford that because I had life, and that was an indeterminate sentence that I could have went from 7 years of eligibility to from now on.
Yeah,
you know.
Right.
So you know, how did that work? It worked like a whole bunch of other stuff that people deny, is that it worked based on the disproportionate rate of African Americans being incarcerated and Latinos being incarcerated, and the parts of the population, we've been incarcerated 10 times the rate of white people and probably 3 times the rate of Latinos. So it worked that way based on also race, but nobody could see it. Now, in terms of restorative justice, how about the narrative around the question of punishment is so potent, we refuse to actually recognize that we openly practice in slavery. You know, and involuntary servitude is slavery by a different name.
Right, right.
You know, involuntary servitude, the narrative is so potent it either renders it invisible or justify the practice of it.
Right. So, folks, what he's talking about is in the Constitution. It's also, I think, in the Constitution of the U.S. too. Is that
it's the
basically
13th Amendment in the Constitution of the U.S.
right? So they basically abolish slavery, except, and it says that there's an exception clause in for people who are incarcerated in prison. So
unless you're duly convicted of a crime,
right?
You know,
right.
And not only are you duly convicted of a crime, if you put it in context, what was some of the things that they was calling crime initially at the conclusion of ending slavery? You came out with laundering laws. You came out with vagrancy. You came out with stealing pigs because hungry people was actually being freed. There's a whole bunch of other scenarios that actually preceded any of that stuff. And what also drives mass incarceration was the question of you couldn't possibly pay for it if you had to actually force people to pay people. So what you did is, as a result of practicing mass incarceration, you also had to actually generate that through free labor. You couldn't maintain 2 million people in custody without extracting the labor.
Right, right. Yeah. It was a way
And
for them
by the
to pay
way,
for it. And also, my understanding was that other companies would take advantage of it and get some very cheap labor for their
yeah,
company.
yeah. At a certain point, if we get down to, Starbucks was guilty.
Yeah.
Victoria's Secret was guilty. You got people who's actually making phone calls that's guilty. All of those other stuff, and if you get to the extreme stuff, with people are getting transferred from Hawaii to the middle of the continent of the United States, we can start talking about human trafficking.
Yeah.
But what
Okay.
I'm saying is, at no point do we have these conversations, and at a certain point, maybe the thing that really stands out about me writing the book, because I was active a long time before I wrote the book. Me writing the book get me invited to do lectures at Harvard.
Wow. That's pretty impressive.
you know,
Yeah.
so like in the meantime, before I even got to Harvard, when you said the Ban the Box campaign was a fight to end structural discrimination. Now, ban the box is the question on the box is the question that comes on the application. Have you been convicted of a felony? Have you been convicted of a crime?
Right, right.
Right? And that right there wasn't put on the application to benefit people coming home from prison. It was put on the application to keep people from hiring people who came home from prison.
No, that's a crazy thing. I mean, that just drives me nuts when they have something like that on the books. You have to say that you were a felon. Do you want these people to be rehabilitated and get back into society or not? I mean, it's just like how can people expect to be hired if they have to keep raising their hand and saying I was a felon, and then there's a lot of employers that will just refuse to hire you.
How about this? Have you ever told a lie?
Yeah, right. Have you ever told a lie? Well, everyone's told a lie, but
So suppose I go around saying, you're a liar.
right, exactly. Yeah. Right.
You're a liar. We brand you as a liar straight up. So like your wife won't trust you. You won't get it.
Well, religious people do that. They say, "Have you ever lied before?" And you have to admit, yes. Well, then they say you're a liar and you're a sinner, and you need to jump through our religious hoops before you can be accepted. But the other thing that really drove is amazing is the incarceration rate. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the global North, 531 per 100,000 people. And then you compare that to other countries. Let's say England, 143, France, 107, Canada, 85, and Norway, only 55. Why do we incarcerate so many people in our country?
Hey, like some parts of that is based on race, but the other parts of it, like when I said that, I said learning how to read made my world smaller and larger at the same time. So like when I was in prison, it made it definitely smaller. I can touch both walls. I knew that there was a broader society and a larger structure. So how about this? I learned how to read in part because I had a life sentence, and what I wanted to determine that in the event that I could escape, who didn't have extradition treaties with the United States. I have to, because like people had escaped, and then they say like, where did you go? I was running around in the same circle I had been running around. But once that I learned how to read, and it made it larger, when I ultimately got out and I didn't escape, it takes me into El Salvador. It takes me into Norway, talking about looking for a restorative justice practices that it existed outside the United States and what was the origins of that particular practice. So
Right,
it took
right.
me into Cuba. It took me into Auckland, New Zealand. It took me into South Africa. So what I'm saying is that the education that I got, even though I didn't escape, what it ultimately did was that when I started doing, I'm a non-traditional learner.
Right.
I learned from experience. And at a certain point, it wasn't that I just worked at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. I was the executive director of Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. And at my retirement, which just happened earlier this year, the
Okay.
thing that I ultimately built was an organization. I had 31 employees, and I was operating probably a budget of $4 million. I bought a building costing $2.5 million, and I paid for it in less than 6 years. And I bought the building for the next generation of organizers. And at the point of me actually retiring, I retired in less than a year after I paid off the building. So
let's talk about that. What are you addressing in those two organizations? Um, the one for
Legal
children.
Services for Prisoners with Children, here's some of the victories.
Yeah, go ahead. Share.
Some of the victories that we did is that revenge is such a issue. I can remember going to the legislature or having an organization go to the legislature, and we fought for several cycles just to stop shackling pregnant women. At the point that I came into prison, if you served solitary confinement and you did 6 months, that was a long sentence. What happened then when people get so vengeful and so frightened that they started putting people into the whole situation or either solitary confinement for multiple decades at a time? I helped sue the California Department of Corrections to get them release people who were had served 20, 30, and 40 years in the hole.
Oh, wow.
When it came down to the education, how did I use the education? It wasn't like I just banned the box. Barack Obama said that they should ban the box. So
Right.
a term that I helped create, the president of the United States actually used it, and he actually invited me to the White House and gave me the Champion of Change Award.
Very nice. Very nice.
So, and when people asked me, was I crazy? It wasn't like polite ways that they were asking me. I wish I could say, when we talked about ending structural discrimination, because that's what we was talking about. The vehicle in which we used it was the term ban the box. And when I said we're going to ban the box, the question became, nigga, are you crazy?
Yeah, right.
And by the way, I'm not crazy. 263 or 267 million people in the United States stay in the jurisdiction in which I did the work and inspire people to do the work. And they live under jurisdiction that they've banned the box. In the state of California, we banned the box, and people are not permitted to ask that question until a conditional offer of employment. You got to have a nexus for people who committed a crime if you're going to actually deny them employment with what they were doing. So if you hiring a driver, do you not give him employment because at one point he embezzled money? Should you not give him that job? Or he was an addict, because I'm also a recovering addict, but to the most part, when I'm talking to people, what's today, the 20th?
Yeah.
So here's what it is. I haven't picked up a drink. I haven't smoked a joint, and I haven't did drugs as of the day, 34 years.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So most of the time I'm talking to people and they saying, I'm saying I'm a recovering addict. They don't understand that the last person that got drunk was them.
Yeah.
The last person who's probably doing a drunk driving. And by the way, I created not only when you said I created another organization, also created a drug treatment program in the middle of East Palo Alto. And
Oh,
East
okay.
Palo
So
Alto
you've
was one
got
of
a
the murder
drug treatment
capital
program for prisoners, for
for anybody.
anyone,
It's not
for
just,
anyone.
people,
Okay.
because East Palo Alto at a certain point was named the murder capital of the United States.
Oh, wow.
And what, and I got a unique set of skills because I build things.
Mm-hmm.
And when East Palo Alto was being named the murder capital of the United States, what was driving that was what was driving the violence was the crack epidemic.
Right.
He also had an AIDS epidemic that was festering too, or a pandemic, because that was worldwide, a pandemic that was happening called AIDS. And what was also there was the degree of violence there. Last year, in that organization that I built is over 33 years old, could be 34 years old. And last year was the first year that we didn't have a murder in East Palo Alto.
Okay. All right.
So like at a certain point, it's not only the retribution system is hurting people in prison. It's hurting society in general.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because like at a certain point, if I'm building an apparatus and I see things a little bit different, like we never sent Betty Ford to the pen.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. She was an addict and she never got sent. Right.
She ain't never got, right. It could have been like race and a whole bunch of other stuff. She was a president's wife.
Right. Right. So I wanted to ask you, what are the solutions? If you could reform our criminal justice system, what would it be like in your mind?
What it'd be like is that we probably had to start dreaming of a system that didn't have prisons.
Mm-hmm. It had something other than prisons as a way.
Other than prisons, it's like, even right now, the fight that I've been engaged in for probably most of my life, we got Gavin Newsom saying he's going to adopt the Norway model in California.
What do you think of that?
San Quentin State Prison. He just started calling it, hung out the sign, San Quentin Rehabilitative Center. So I would have, and first of all, I don't think that they can incarcerate 2 million people at a time, and not necessarily, you have to be stupid or callous to actually think that you're not incorporating genius. Somebody in there that probably could help, So it's like, at a certain point, with a limited amount of education, and if I would have got an opportunity to actually acquire that education earlier, I don't know who I would have been at a certain point. And if I built, I was on the founding board of Free at Last. Generally, when people having a conversation with me, they don't even know where I impacted their life. So when they talk about the prison industrial complex, that was an obscure term out of a Mike Davis book, and I taught the world how to say it. So at a certain point, what happens when I get out of prison and I go to school and I'm finding that the school is inadequate, and I didn't know that everybody else in the class, because I majored in criminal justice, was there for upward mobility and they were law enforcement.
Oh, I see. Yeah, right.
I went to school to figure out, like, how do I dismantle?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So what do you think of what do you think of Norway's system? I've written about that in my book. It seems like it's a very very effective way of doing it, in that prison guards are actually trained to be to do rehabilitative to be actually become friends with the prisoners and help them rehabilitate, is the way I understand it.
They see people who go to prison, they still see them as their neighbor and don't see them as their threat.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right. So like, questions like, because like, here's what's on my bucket list. My bucket list is that at Legal Services for Prisons with Children, if I have something on the bucket list, the majority of my staff that was there is formerly incarcerated people. If I have
Right.
something on my bucket list, I want to shut down the organization, take them to Norway, and actually see what they got. At the point that I'm jumping around every place else, what I'm doing is looking for a remedy.
Yeah, right.
Looking for a remedy about how do I address this problem, right?
Right.
And some parts of the problem is not only the practice of retribution as a practice of restoring the health and soundness of a community. We haven't got there. So it's like,
No.
like some parts of what you said earlier about this is what you learned about the practice of religion in certain sectors. Then we need to change that practice because that people are actually being thinking that that's going to benefit them and get them to heaven. I don't think they're going to get there.
Right.
And
Well, I mean,
I think it's going to make it, everybody else is going to be miserable.
yeah. Well, we have a way of looking at wrongdoing in the world that it's punishment is, God wants to punish people. You have to be punished for punishment's sake. It's kind of like, okay, that's the payment. And it's a transactional thing. You got to pay something and then we'll let you out. But the rehabilitative way of looking at it is, like you said, you're looking at them. Oh, these are actually my neighbors and I want to help restore them and I want to treat them with dignity. And that, if you do that, a lot of them won't even end up in prison to begin with. And the ones that do, you can help really rehabilitate them so that they, don't come out a better criminal.
I went to Cuba and like after I went to New Zealand and I went to I visited a whole bunch of different prisons all over the United States, all over the world.
Really? Okay. All right.
Right? And I went to New Zealand and when I was admitted into New Zealand, because like I didn't know, I thought the only thing I needed was a passport, and they asked me, did I have a visa?
Oh, you didn't have a visa when you got there. Oh no.
No, I didn't have a visa. In fact, I didn't even know what a visa was. I thought it was a credit card. And I said, well, I got, $3,000 cash in the money bill, and I'm only here for a short.
Right. Okay.
I'm only passing through. I don't want to live here, I just want to I was going to a conference.
Oh yeah, right. Just going to a conference. Yeah.
I was going to a conference on penal abolition.
Okay.
And so I thought they should recognize somebody like me would come to the conference.
Yes, right,
But
right.
they didn't recognize that, and it wasn't necessarily what the conference was for. It was people that was educated on sabbaticals, and they would go to different places and they actually study and have conversations, and they have conferences. So I showed up. Then when they gave me getting off in New Zealand, they had 10 questions on the when you're getting ready to land the plane, and they asked the 10 questions. Have you been to prison?
Oh my God.
Have you been to prison more than 5 years? Have you been to prison more than 10? And so, those was the only 3 questions I answered yes. So I thought I had passed with 70%.
Yeah, right.
They shipped me off to a different line.
Okay.
And thank God, I had a scrap piece of paper with a fax number to the conference, the conference organizers. And I asked them, could I send a fax somewhere? Because I was invited to this conference.
Right.
And I've just been on the plane, 13 to 18 hours or something like that.
Yeah, right.
And I sent them a fax. Who was the keynote speaker in New Zealand at that conference was the former prime minister of the country.
Oh, wow. That's
Waved
amazing.
me in.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, you had some connections. Right.
And then I was waved in by the former prime minister of the country, everybody treated me like I was a whole high-profile dignitary. So they
Yeah.
showed me their prison system.
Okay.
Right? And when I first got to New Zealand, I didn't know that in 1968, Maori people considered themselves black based on the 1968 Olympics. You know, there's a whole bunch of culture stuff I learned.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I learned, that inside of that prison, there was an etching on the wall that became the when you see me put this hat on and you see the fist.
All of us are none. Yeah.
All of us are none. What I seen was an etching like this on the yard of a prison, Mount Eden Prison in New Zealand.
Okay.
And that became symbolized, but it was also symbolized with John Carlos and everybody else in the 1968 Olympics when they lifted their hands up. But that right there was an experience. And shortly thereafter, I went to Cuba. When I went to Cuba, what drove me to go to Cuba wasn't like seeing if, that it was true about people that didn't have an extradition treaty, even though I was chasing a person to have to do an interview with her. And, I went to Cuba and and I found Asada Shakur. What I was asking her, how did the Cubans deal with the question of domestic violence?
Okay.
Because we were doing poorly here. Women were getting beat up and they were being injured and they were being murdered. And being that I wasn't into the retribution of human beings, I was figuring like, how do you change the practice?
Exactly.
To safeguard something different.
Right.
So I went to, so like some parts of,
So what did you learn there?
What I learned there was that the community was more responsible for actually safeguarding themselves. Like, the person that was beating up my neighbor and he was beating up his girlfriend and all the rest of it. At a certain point, I went to Cuba for like, how do I address this clown that was staying next door? Because I knew, based on him being in prison, me staying next door to this person who was his girlfriend, he thought she had betrayed him. And the only thing that she was trying to do was to actually collect child support or welfare.
Right.
And they assigned them the practice of trying to extract resources while he was in prison from her. So he thought that she betrayed him. And I'm saying, you had kids for her. That wasn't betrayal, And, we started kicking it as guys, But I was going to Cuba saying, like, how did you come up with this thing? And they said other men and other people would address if people were doing violence to women, And my neighbor, ultimately, I said, man, like you got a very beautiful wife, and she won't stay that way long if you keep beating her up. And the other thing of it is, if you don't recognize that the only reason that she took money from the government and the government started pursuing you was that you earned the living doing crime. She did not. And she had to actually support and sustain the children, and nobody, had explained it to him. And then one of the manuals that we wrote at Legal Services for Prisoners, we put out manuals, was the Incarcerated Parents Manual. And when I met him, what I started doing was going into California Youth Authority, and I started telling people who had children, because at 19, I had 2 children by 2 different women. So like, somebody should have talked to me. And at a certain point, they started jacking up child support payments for people who was being held as slaves, knowing that they couldn't pay. And about time that you got out, you would be so indebted with back child support that when you got a job, your initial job, that if you got one, you was lucky enough to get one, your checks would be garnished.
Yeah.
And being that, and I think that right there, that practice is what makes people, the first thing I think that we need to do, when you ask me that original question, the first thing that we need to do if we're going to release people from prison in a real way is remove desperation off the table.
Okay.
People should be entitled to food, clothing, and shelter.
Right.
People should be entitled to work. You know, people should have
Exactly.
a certain degree of being able, and you shouldn't necessarily charge people. Suppose you was buying a house, and you took out a mortgage for 15 years, and somebody said that you had to keep paying the mortgage, even after you had exceeded paid the mortgage for the 15 years. Suppose they said, well, you have to pay it another 15 years.
Yeah, right. It's like that, right? You
So
have to pay. You're
and
paying twice, right?
so
Your
at a
prison
certain point,
sentence and all the injustices of coming out. So it sounds like that approach was more of a community-based approach, getting other people helping to intervene in domestic violence.
yet not only that is that when I created the drug program and Poor helped build the drug program, what we was trying to do was stop violence. We knew
Yeah.
what was driving violence, so it was like, and to be committed enough that I'm still on the board of Free at Last, and I've been on the board for over 30 years. And in terms of my dreams or my vision, I had so many. I went to a meeting last Saturday, and I hadn't been to a meeting at my building and actually said anything in a meeting for a long period of time. And when I walked in the room, people were still referring to me as Dorsey I haven't used in 17 years.
Mm-hmm.
Dorsey I haven't used in 14 years. My life is completely different.
Right. That's great. Yeah.
And I can tell them something like this. As a result of your life being different, your children's life is going to be different.
Right. Exactly. So
like,
that's really wonderful. We're running out of time, but I just want to have one
by
more.
the way, I want to tell you something else.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you haven't read a book called Danielle Charette, Until We Reckon, that's about restorative justice.
Until we reckon.
Until we reckon.
Okay.
Because at a certain point, when you ask me what was I convicted of, this is where I got. When I was in prison, they kept asking me about remorse. And I didn't know what it was because I knew before the echo left for the gunshot, I regretted being there. But I could have equally regretted not getting away. When my granddaughter was graduating from a junior high school, my great-granddaughter was graduating from junior high school. And I knew that when she came off that stage, I was going to give her money. I was going to tell her she was so beautiful and so Black, and I expected a whole bunch out of her. The other thing while I was writing this book, I thought about who was telling the guy that died in that liquor store that night, who was telling his grandchildren that they were lovely, that they were beautiful.
Having
and I learned how to make the distinction between regret and remorse. And my grandchild taught me that. So it's like at a certain point, how do you get to these lessons that actually make you understand in a deeper way our common humanity?
Yes, right,
That's
exactly.
Something else that got to happen inside of is not being executed well in the retributive system.
Yeah, no, it's true. You have to learn empathy for your fellow human beings, and that's how you restore relationships. That's how you get to restoration.
That's how you get there. But like I said, at a certain point, and by the way, the other thing that we do at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, last year, what we did is we went out and found 236 children with incarcerated parents.
Mm-hmm.
And every Christmas, we give them brand new bikes. We don't tell them that bikes came from Santa Claus. We tell them that bikes came from their parents in prison, because our children need to be loved and they need to know that their parents love them.
Oh, that's a great program. Yeah.
So it's like, so I can tell you about, we're doing suing. I can tell you about we doing policy work. But
Hmm.
some of the things that people don't see is how do we reaching out to a deeper level about how do we actually care for our community as a whole. So the bike that the police took from me,
Hmm.
that I ultimately took from other people, how do I pay that thing back? And how I paid it back was put it into a program that we then gave away thousands of bicycles to people who.
Excellent.
So it's like,
Excellent.
so it's like having like that type of consciousness and that being moved that way, where
Hmm.
it's not like I didn't change because they were shooting tear gas on me. I changed because I started loving people.
Yeah, right. That's great. No, that's great. That's really part of the restorative uh, justice model is realizing our humanity and our shared humanity, and starting to have empathy for others, love for others, treat them like our neighbors, and get out of this cycle of punishment for punishment's sake and being very
And by the
punitive.
way, the other thing I really need to do is it took me 4 years to write the book.
Yeah.
It took me a lifetime to actually put enough into it that I thought I had a story for the book. And so many people had actually told me I should write a book because, like, I was in the movie 13. I've been quoted by the President of the United States
Yeah, right. It was time for you to come out with a book. Right.
with a
That's great.
book. And
Yeah.
some of the things that I'm saying right now, when me and you talking, I think that people should go out and purchase a copy of the book because I didn't cover everything that's in the book. So, like, if they can't do anything else, they can go out and purchase What Kind of Bird Can't Fly by Dorsey Nunn. And you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
get that at Barnes and Noble, or you can get it through Amazon, or
Okay,
you
we're
can
gonna
get it in Haiti. What you call them? Because that right there is
yeah.
something that people should do. And at the same time,
We're
uh,
gonna put all that in the show notes, how people can get the book, What Kind of Bird Can't Fly, a memoir of resilience and resurrection. It's really a remarkable story. And also, we'll put in the show notes links to the organizations, um, All of Us or None and LSPC, and you'll be able to see, people will be able to see all the kinds of things that you guys are doing to improve the lives of incarcerated people, especially during the incarceration and upon release. So, thank you so much, Dorsey, for joining us today. We've learned a lot about restorative justice and how the need for it, et cetera. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
hey, thank you for having me, and and uh, and I apologize for every time that I cut you off.
Oh, no, no, I probably cut you off too. No problem. No problem about that.
Because
All right.
I've seen people do these interviews and
Yeah,
somebody's
right.
dying out there picking out questions.
Right, right. All right, we'll put all that stuff in the show notes, folks. And then until next time, enjoy responsibly.